Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us. We're going to get going in just 1 minute. We would love to see your organizations and where you're joining us from. If you want to drop that in the chat, so your name, your organization, and where in the state you are joining us from, and we will get going shortly. Some Marietta, Northwest Georgia, Naja, I'm assuming that's Atlanta, Gwinnett, Glenn. Okay, so we got some coastal people. Savannah, more coastal, awesome. We are going to go ahead and get started to be respectful of everyone's time. So I am Jill Walsh, the Assistant Director at Prevent Child Abuse Georgia, and we host just ongoing webinars related to child abuse and neglect prevention to help with technical assistance or just further educate our network of providers on things that they're working with or just to expand their knowledge in areas where they haven't yet worked at. And we have joining us here today, Naisha McDowell. She is the director of the One Response Team at the Children Advocacy Centers of Georgia. She is responsible for kind of taking the state lead in response to human trafficking victims and survivors and providing services both in the immediate and thereafter. So I hope I did that justice. She is also a former alumni and colleague at Prevent Child Abuse Georgia. We love to kind of take that ownership of her. She is super awesome. And she's going to be talking about familial CSEC today. This is an encore presentation of our conference. At our 2013 conference in September we just had, her room was totally filled out, and so we had to turn people away for their room. So we're happy to be able to offer this and have her back to give this presentation again for everyone who missed it or who wanted to view it again and share it with others. So I'm going to turn it over to Naisha.
Thank you, Jill. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today and just taking some time out of your day to discuss a very important topic, which is familial trafficking or family facilitated CSEC. And we'll explain what all of those acronyms mean once we hop into the presentation. Thank you, Jill and PCA Georgia, for inviting me back. Always happy to come home, as I like to say, and talk to the folks that are supporting PCA Georgia or are part of the network. So I am going to go ahead and share my screen here and we will jump right in. And please let me know in the chat if you have any technical difficulties or if you're having trouble hearing me, so that way Jill can just let me know if there's anything I need to pay attention to. So we'll go ahead and jump right in. So today's presentation is called When Home is Where the Hurt Is, and this is an exploration of family facilitated CSEC. And today I am coming to you all from the Children's Advocacy Centers of Georgia. I am the director of our Commercial Sexual Exploitation of Children Response Team. And our mission is to serve as the central point of contact for victims of commercial sexual exploitation of children and the agencies that support them for a more coordinated and effective system response to CSEC. Children's Advocacy Centers of Georgia, if you're not familiar with us, we serve as the umbrella organization for our 49 child advocacy centers throughout the state of Georgia. If you are not familiar with what a child advocacy center is, basically, we provide resources and support to victims of sex trafficking, victims of abuse, neglect, and witness to crime within those local communities. And so your child advocacy centers provide forensic interviews to children that have experienced trauma. They provide therapeutic services. They provide advocacy services. So if you do not know who your local child advocacy center is, I encourage you to go to cacga.org and look that up. We have a map on our website that can help you in finding out who your local child advocacy center is. So if we have any CAC folks on the line, shout out to you all and thank you for all the great work that you do. So for our CSEC response team, that is the second part of Children's Advocacy Centers of Georgia and the services that we provide. We provide direct services to victims of child sex trafficking in the form of assessment, intensive case management, and advocacy. And we also facilitate trainings, such as the training that we will be discussing today. All right, so I want to just kind of give a trigger warning for today's presentation. We are going to be discussing some difficult topics. The topic of familial child sex trafficking is a tough one. Some of the stories and case studies that you may hear today may be a little difficult. So we encourage you all to take care of yourself. If you need to take a step away, please do so. And just make sure at the end of the day, you're taking care of yourself and anyone that may be in earshot of the information that we are sharing today. But to help us do that, we have a young fella here who is going to talk to us about imagination. And so we're going to listen to this video here. And I just encourage you all to start thinking of ways that you have used your imagination, even either in the work that you do or in your childhood. But we'll hear from him first, and then we'll engage in a short activity in the chat.
Imagination is one of the best things that's ever happened.
Yeah.
The first person who imagine something like cave drawings or something like that.
Yeah.
That is what started everything. Like the buildings, the cars, even the microphone, to be honest.
Do you have any advice for adults on using their imagination?
You're just sad. You just gotta use your imagination, come up with something good. Like, let's say you watch something. Put yourself in that reality and make whatever you watch more fun. Like when your kids want to go to bed, they're tired, they want a story. Imagine a story. That's the best thing you could do.
Do you appreciate it when your parents use their imaginations with you?
Yeah, I really do.
Can we play a little quick game?
Yeah.
Imagine.
Tree robots.
A thing in your water that gives everyone elf ears.
Yes.
Yeah, that would be awesome.
Jetpacks that are backpacks.
Oh, yeah. So do you think you'll ever lose your imagination?
No, I'll never lose my imagination. When I grow up, I want to be an engineer.
Really?
Yeah, and if you're an engineer, you need to use your imagination. Yeah, because if you use your imagination as an engineer, you can make it into something that's not even made yet. We're here because of imagination, and imagination is one of the, key things about life that you're gonna need as you go on. Thanks.
Thank you. High five. Good work.
I love hearing from him and his standpoint on using our imagination. So if you all could, in the chat, think of ways that you use your imagination in your childhood or even your teenagehood or young adulthood. And if you could just share a few examples. And if we have a few brave folks that would like to come off mute, Jill, if you could help me get those folks off mute, we'll take 2 or 3 people who are interested in coming off mute to share how they used their imagination in their childhood. So feel free to share in the chat, or you can come off mute if you'd like.
Hello, can everybody hear me?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. I think that I'm in line with what you're talking about. When I was a little girl, that was when TV was black and white. I grew up in a segregated society, and my grandparents were very influential in the society. They always went around people and did different work and all this. Grew up in rural South Carolina, and people will tell you that black and white people didn't get along, but that's a lie. We got along and we survived, okay? And one thing that I used in my imagination, they weren't talking to me. They didn't say anything to me because I was the only grandchild and I was spoiled and I was used to people talking to me and saying, oh, she's so cute. So they would never talk to me. And I just grew up and I always thought that white people couldn't see me.
Wow.
I just thought they couldn't see me because they just never said anything to me. And when my grandparents took me around other people, they would always say, hey, Jackie, you look so cute today. I like your dress, so and so. They never looked at me. They never said anything. So I just thought they couldn't see me.
Okay. So in your childhood, that was your experience of just maybe not being seen as a kid. And that was sort of what you thought as a kid. Okay. Thank you for sharing that.
I don't think it bothered me too bad. It was just a reality that I thought I had, put it that way.
Gotcha. Okay. Well, I appreciate you sharing. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Don't forget, okay, we have Miss Carol cooking mud pies and decorating it with snails and worms. Absolutely. I definitely made some mud pies as a kid. Playing pretend to be fairies or mermaids. Thank you, Tiffany. Believing in Santa, fairies, and magic. Absolutely. Thank you for that, Daisy. Anyone else? Any interesting childhood stories or imaginations? Building forts that were mansions. Absolutely, Jill. We were big fans of forts, knocking down old trees so that you can create a bridge to pass a moat or something with water under it. Tamika Jonas, as an only child, my imagination was pretty much all I had. I wanted to be a teacher as a child and taught by dolls and stuffed animals. I ran restaurants while serving play food and mud pies, playing Barbie. Absolutely. So all of those are beautiful examples of how, as children, we used our imagination, sometimes in ways to just have fun, sometimes in ways to protect ourselves if there were some traumatic things happening or just things that we would rather not be a part of. And so we encourage you all throughout today's presentation, if any of the content gets especially difficult, or if you need to take a moment to yourself, feel free to do what you did as a kid and go back into your imagination and use that as a way to escape for a little while and then come back to the content as you're ready. And of course, you can always take a break from exiting the program and then coming back. But at the end of the day, we just want you all to take good care of yourselves, and we can follow the advice of this little guy here and use our imagination to do just that. Let's jump right into the content here. So again, today we're discussing familial trafficking or family facilitated CSEC. CSEC stands for commercial sexual exploitation. So we're going to do some level setting and define the issue before we jump into some of the other content today. So first off, many of you may be familiar with the term human trafficking, and we typically divide human trafficking out into two different subsets: labor trafficking and sex trafficking. Human trafficking is a crime that involves exploiting a person for labor or sex services. And then labor trafficking involves the recruitment, harboring, transportation, provision, or obtaining of a person for labor services by force, fraud, or coercion. Now with sex trafficking, this includes a commercial sex act that is induced by force, fraud, or coercion when the person performing the act is under the age of 18. We refer to it as CSEC, and we'll talk about what CSEC is as well. So commercial sexual exploitation of children is sexual activity involving a child in exchange for something of value or promise thereof to the child or another person. And in this situation, the child is basically being treated as a commercial sex object. To simplify the definition, we define CSEC as a child or sexual acts with the child being exchanged for items of value. And items of value can include food, shelter, money, you name it. Per Georgia law, commercial sexual exploitation of children is a form of violence and abuse against children. So it is reportable not only to law enforcement, but to the Division of Family and Children Services as well. So we, of course, always want you to know that if you're on this call today and you work with children in any capacity, you are considered a mandated reporter, and Prevent Child Abuse Georgia has beautiful, great training on what your responsibilities are as a mandated reporter. But familial trafficking is a form of abuse against a child that is reportable to DFACS, and we want you to keep that in mind. And we'll talk about other ways that you can get children referred to services as well. So oftentimes when we go across the state presenting on the topic of commercial sexual exploitation, we'll often hear, well, that doesn't happen here. We don't have traffickers and pimps in our community. That's not something that we have to worry about. And so we have to sort of counter some of those conversations with the fact that commercial sexual exploitation of children can look different depending on the community that you live in. What I often say is that whatever the social ill or societal ill that's impacting your community is, trafficking may have some parallels with that. So if the experience of poverty is something that's greatly impacting your community, or substance use dependence disorder is something that's greatly impacting your community, the risk factors and the vulnerabilities that are present with those societal ills can also be present with trafficking. So our friends at Rights for Girls in DC actually organized CSEC into 4 paradigms, and we ended up adding a 5th. And so we'll talk about the different ways that trafficking can manifest. One way is through familial trafficking, which we're going to talk about today. And that occurs when a family member exchanges sexual acts with a child for goods, substances, rent, services, money, or status within the community. And then we have gang facilitated exploitation. And this occurs when the youth may be exploited as initiation into the gang or to bring revenue into the gang or criminal enterprise. With trafficker facilitated exploitation, we often hear about this when we watch movies where there's maybe one person who is primarily exploiting or trafficking the young person, and the traffickers target vulnerable children or young adults and lure them into sex trafficking by using psychological manipulation, drugs, or violence. And so that's another form. Oftentimes, they may even prey on the child or appear as a romantic interest to that child. And then the child believes that they're in a relationship with this person and may not necessarily see this person as someone who is exploiting or trafficking them. Another form is buyer facilitated exploitation. You may often hear this form of exploitation referred to as survival sex, but our friends at the National Centers for Missing and Exploited Children are really starting to deviate from using that terminology because, again, we want to put the onus of the crime on the individuals, the adults that are committing the crime, not the children. So we instead use the terminology buyer facilitated exploitation, and this includes any sexual act exchanged for an extreme need, including sex for money or shelter or a ride from point A to point B, you name it. And then lastly, we have technology facilitated exploitation, and youth exploitation is facilitated via social media or the internet. And what we like to say is that these forms of exploitation can co-occur. They can occur at the same time. One can lead to another. What we often see is that a child's exploitation may start off on the internet and then may eventually turn into something even greater than that, whether it's gang facilitated or trafficker facilitated, you name it. So we just like to point out the different types of exploitation so that you can understand it can look different depending on the victim. It can look different depending on the community or the region. So it's easy for us to confuse familial trafficking or family facilitated CSEC with intrafamilial sexual abuse. And oftentimes there are very fine lines between the two. However, there are some distinctions that we'd like to point out. In family facilitated CSEC cases, the presence of an economic exchange, regardless of the form of commerce, is always present. And so some intrafamilial sexual abuse victims may receive money or rewards or some type of incentive to ensure that they're silent or compliant as a part of the abuser's grooming behavior. But typically, there is a commercial component in terms of family facilitated CSEC. What we will say is that in terms of similarities between the two, both intrafamilial sexual abuse and family facilitated CSEC normalize unwanted sexual acts and are unspoken yet distinct forms of child abuse against children. What we've also seen in some of the cases that we've worked throughout the years is that a child may start off as a intrafamilial sexual abuse victim where someone in the family is grooming and sexually abusing that child, and then it may eventually turn into family facilitated CSEC where that person then begins to invite others into the abuse and grooming of that child at the expense of that person who's coming into that. So they may be required to pay the person's rent in order to have access to that child sexually, or pay a car payment in order to have access to that child sexually. So if you could, for those of you who've done this work for any amount of time, put a 1 in the chat if you've been a part of an intrafamilial sexual abuse case that may have morphed into a family facilitated CSEC case in some capacity, or just a 2 in the chat if you have ever been a part of the intervention or a part of looking into a family facilitated CSEC case. So 1 in the chat if you've been a part of a case that was intrafamilial sexual abuse and eventually turned into CSEC, and then a 2 if it's mostly been a CSEC, family facilitated CSEC case. Are a lot of ones where folks have seen that sort of transition from, oh, we initially thought it was just someone in the home that was abusing the child, but we eventually learned that that child was being exploited as well. So thank you to those of you who do this work. I know that it can be very heavy and taxing work, but we appreciate the work that you do and the effort that you put forth to make sure kids are safe. See a few more 2s coming in. Thank you all. All right, so let's explore the issue. How does familial trafficking or family facilitated CSEC impact children? So we often receive questions around what are some statistics and data around the issue of familial trafficking. And as you all know, the issue of human trafficking is very difficult to enumerate because number one, it's an underreported issue. We are not seeing the numbers that we probably should be seeing due to fear, stigma, not having access to resources to even make a report. And then it's unreported. It goes unreported oftentimes where people don't even know that it's something that should be reported, especially in the case of familial trafficking cases. A lot of times the victims are too young to even access adults that they can report to, or they simply don't have the language to describe what's even happening to them. We can look at some of the prevalence numbers from other parts of the country and from other areas of sexual violence against persons to help us derive some numbers. And so, according to the U.S. Department of Justice, 34% of child sexual abuse is inflicted by a family member. So we do know that there are individuals within the context of a family who are inflicting abuse on a child. So we know that on a basic level. And that statistic, of course, is much lower than it probably could be. And so a 2019 data report from the U.S. National Human Trafficking Hotline reported that a familial relationship was the second most common form of induction into commercial sex. So that's telling us that oftentimes the victims of trafficking that our communities are serving and working with were first introduced into a life of exploitation by someone close to them, someone in their familial unit. And so we have to be aware that oftentimes that can be the pathway for a lot of our victims. It started with a family member or someone close to the family. In Georgia, 20 to 25% of confirmed cases of commercial sexual exploitation are family facilitated. So that is a very rough estimate because, again, a lot of times we're talking about younger victims who do not have the language to disclose what's happening to them. And then oftentimes our service providers and professionals don't necessarily know what to look for so that they can report familial trafficking. But we are doing a better job, and we'll talk about how you as professionals can be on the lookout for familial trafficking as well. So oftentimes what we notice is that we are well equipped to sometimes identify youth that are being exploited through gangs, through other traffickers, via other means of exploitation. We talked about that paradigm earlier. And so sometimes the characteristics of youth who are impacted by other types of exploitation can look different than the characteristics of kids that are victims of familial trafficking. And so we want to talk about those characteristics to point out the differences to better help you understand, number one, why sometimes we don't even know what to look for. And number two, how oftentimes we'll see an overrepresentation of victims by other forms of CSEC versus the familial family facilitated CSEC. So some characteristics of youth impacted by other forms of exploitation can include chronic, truant, runaway, homeless, gang-involved youth. So these youth are often already on our radars because they are intersecting with our child welfare systems and our juvenile justice systems. And so if those children are getting basically they're coming to our attention because of behavioral challenges or because the family unit has been disrupted, we are more apt to recognize them, right? Also, our LGBTQIA plus youth are often at risk of other forms of trafficking as well. Oftentimes, they're 7 times more likely to experience exploitation just due to issues within their family unit, not accepting them, not providing them with the support that they need. And oftentimes, those youth will look for that support outside of the home. And unfortunately, traffickers will prey on that. Children involved in foster care and juvenile justice systems, so that dual system involvement is certainly a characteristic of many of the youth that we serve that are victims of other forms of trafficking. Substance dependence disorder, many of the kids that we work with may have some type of addiction that they are battling and trying to work through. Friends or associates that are already involved in CSEC or sex work or trafficking is another characteristic. And then a high number of suspected sexual partners. Oftentimes what we also see is that these youth are often older. They may be between the ages of 12, 13, all the way up to the age of 18. And again, more easily identifiable because these children can disclose, they have language around what's happening with them. They're developmentally in a better place to sort of help be identified as a victim, and then they're intersecting with systems that make it a little bit easier for us to identify them. Now, when we talk about familial trafficking or family facilitated CSEC, we have to consider that it's a unique form of trafficking. And in many ways, we're just beginning to understand it in our field. That's not to say that it hasn't been happening for years and years and years, but we are doing a better job of recognizing it now. And there are communities and organizations across the country that are starting to develop screening tools and other ways to better identify this form of exploitation. So family facilitated CSEC can be difficult to identify because it takes place within the family network and victimizes children that are often too young to understand what's happening to them. So as a result, some of the characteristics of children impacted by family facilitated CSEC are different from the characteristics of children that are impacted by other forms of CSEC. So some of those characteristics for our family facilitated CSEC victims include a victim may be younger. Oops. So a Spring and Cole study in 2018 found that the average age of a victim of familial trafficking in the United States to be 11.5 years old, with some children being as young as 5. We had a case a couple of years ago where 2 young children, one child was, I believe, 3 years old, the other was 5, came into a child advocacy center to get a forensic interview due to suspicions of sexual abuse. The children came in and then during the forensic interview disclosed information about multiple perpetrators coming in and out of the home. And the forensic interviewer was savvy enough to realize, hey, that's concerning. Why do these perpetrators continue to come in and out of the home after we've already identified that they've been a victim in a previous case? So why does the parental figure continue to allow perpetrators to have access to these children? And so this forensic interviewer worked closely with law enforcement to craft age-appropriate questions to better discover what was happening in that home. And so what they ended up finding out through the 5-year-old is that the mother, at certain times, a male perpetrator would come to the home and the mother would say, hey, I need you to go in the room and spend time with this person for some time. And so the parent was actually telling the child to go and spend time with this person. And then law enforcement was able to conduct an investigation to find out that there were some commercial exchanges as well. So the parent was basically being paid for these perpetrators to have access to these children sexually. And so it really took that multidisciplinary team putting their heads together to figure out how they could best, number one, work with that child to get information, and number two, figure out if there were some transactions that they did not know about during their initial investigation. Family members involved in the illegal commercial sex industry. So characteristics of these youth, the family member, whether it's the mother or another parent in the household, may already be involved in some type of commercial sex work, whether they are a sex worker and they are involved in sex work themselves, or the father or paternal figure is someone who is also facilitating commercial sex work, whether they're a trafficker or what have you. And so that's another indicator that we often see in these cases. These children are less likely to be runaways. So a Read et al. Study found that that children trafficked by relatives are less likely to report running away. And we know oftentimes that's because the child is younger and they are fully dependent on that family unit for access to resources, and they don't really have a way of escaping the home. And then they're less likely to have substance use issues. These children, again, because of their age and their developmental stage, they may not necessarily have access to substances. And if they do, then the parent may be the person facilitating their access to those substances. Some additional characteristics are they may have child welfare involvement for neglect. So in a lot of these cases, not only within the state of Georgia, but nationally as well, oftentimes there will be initial reports that the children are being neglected. But after child welfare gets involved and maybe addresses some of the child neglect concerns, the family facilitated trafficking concerns may not rise to the surface. And so this is really good for us to know so that we can continue to monitor families that may be experiencing neglect. And this is not to say that families in the experience of poverty or families that don't have access to certain resources are trafficking their children. That's not to say that. That is to say that sometimes a family that has the experience of neglect may be higher risk for a family member or someone within that family unit trafficking that child. These children are more likely to have witnessed domestic violence. The family may often move and relocate as well. Sometimes that is to evade law enforcement or child welfare involvement. Sometimes that's due to requests by other individuals who want access to the children. So there can be some frequent moving and relocating. And the youth are also less likely to be identified as CSEC victims by child welfare. A common statistic that we quote in this work is that the average age of entry into the commercial sex industry is 12 years old. And then we know that research shows that that is typically 2 years earlier. It's just by the time they're 12, we're starting to identify them. So we're starting to realize through research and data that we are not identifying victims as early as we should be. One study even found that over half of the victims of family facilitated CSEC were poly victims, meaning they had experienced multiple forms of abuse and trauma, whether that was a sexual or physical abuse, they were witnessing domestic violence, maybe there was some neglect or not having access to necessary resources. And so these kids were not only experiencing the family facilitated CSEC, there were other traumas happening within that family unit as well. All right, so you're probably wondering who in the family is facilitating the exploitation of the child. And a surprising finding for many is that mothers are the most common type of trafficker in a familial trafficking case. And this is data that's been collected nationwide that is supporting this. A Sprague and Cole study in 2018 found that the child's mother was the trafficker in 64.5% of cases. And so with that, oftentimes the mother may have some type of substance use dependence disorder that has gone unaddressed, that is leading to the exploitation of the child. The mother herself may be involved in sex work and may just have normalized this form of work as a way of bringing money and resources into the home. There are several different reasons why a parent would choose to exploit their child. In cases where the mother was a trafficker, a second trafficker was also involved 65% of the time in that same study. And so oftentimes there is another person, whether it's the mother's paramour, a boyfriend or a girlfriend, or someone else who's also facilitating the exploitation of that child. We had a youth that we worked with for some time who, when she initially presented to our team, she presented as someone who had a trafficker. We did not have any suspicions that maybe the child's family was involved, but over time that child began disclosing that her exploitation began when she was around 11, 12 years old, after the mom's boyfriend moved into the home and basically put the idea of selling the child online in the mom's head. And unfortunately, from there, things sort of spiraled out of control for that child. And so again, this is just another indication that sometimes the victims that we're seeing later on down the line may have been victims of family facilitated CSEC, but for many of our kids, they are very protective over their family members. Despite being trafficked or traumatized by that family member, they are still very protective of them. So they oftentimes won't even disclose until they have aged out of the system, or they no longer are obligated to maybe share certain details where that person can be held legally accountable or responsible, at least in that child's mind. And so sometimes they wait until later in life to even disclose. There are a few different ways that the mother can appear in the familial trafficking relationship with their child. Some studies have found that the mother-daughter relationship is the most common type of perpetrator-victim relationship. And one study identified these 3 different roles. One, mother as the trafficker or the madam, the person who introduces the child to exploitation and eventually sells them. The second form is the mother trafficker as the addict, meaning sex and sexual acts with that child are being exploited to support that parent's drug habit. And then the third form is that the mother trafficker can be like the mentor or tutor, which occurs when the mother is already involved in the illegal commercial sex industry and is basically training their child to kind of follow in their footsteps. And I want to say that it is very easy to get very upset and frustrated with individuals who do that. And we should be, because it's something that is traumatic that's happening to a child. But unfortunately, for so many families, this is a generational reoccurrence. And for them, in their mind, they are believing, hey, this is how we support our family. This is how we bring income in. And they don't see anything wrong with it. And so sometimes there has to be a generational education for parents, for grandparents, even for aunts and uncles, to help them understand, hey, you were a victim too. That shouldn't have happened to you when a child, and it should not be happening to your child now. So oftentimes there's some re-education that has to happen. And of course, we don't want the child in that unsafe situation. They need to be removed from any unsafe situation. But helping the parents understand why this is unsafe and why it was harmful to their child is helpful as well. So future children are not re-victimized or victimized in the first place. Do we have any questions in the chat that I can briefly answer for us? I can take 1 or 2 questions if anyone wants to share any in the chat.
We just have a comment.
Okay.
Just wow about the average age of identifying victims and how we're missing them earlier on. If anyone else has a
Right.
question, please type it in or feel free to unmute.
Thank you, Jill. All right, so before we jump into this next video, I just want to offer a trigger warning. This is a news video or news clip from a couple of years ago about a familial trafficking case out of Columbus, Georgia. It was actually a case between Columbus, Georgia, and Alabama. But I just want to give a trigger warning to anyone that may be watching this video. It does have some sensitive content, so please make sure if there's children or anyone who is in earshot that they've also sort of been removed from the room if necessary. And also for those of you that live in and around the Columbus, Georgia area, certainly just want to offer that trigger warning and just some empathy to you as well, because this is a difficult case to hear about. So please make sure that you take care of yourself throughout this video.
New details in the brutal murder and rape of Columbus's 5-year-old Kamari Holland. They are coming out now as the indictments of her alleged killers unsealed today.
Jeremy Williams and the girl's mother, Christy Sipple, are charged in the December death in Phoenix City. WRBL News 3's Chuck Williams just broke this story online. He joins us now. Chuck.
Teresa, Phil, what you're about to hear is extremely disturbing. Though many of the unthinkable details of this case are already known, the indictment handed down by a Russell County grand jury last month reveals a few more allegations. Sipple and Williams are each facing 2 counts of human sex trafficking involving the girl's death. One of those counts is conspiracy to commit sex trafficking. The indictment alleges that Sipple sold her daughter to Williams for U.S. currency. It does not state the amount of money involved in the alleged transaction. The indictment also charges Williams with abuse of a corpse. In that count, it is alleged that Williams videotaped the sexual abuse of the little girl after he had strangled her to death. That leads to another count, production of child pornography. Williams is facing 4 death penalty counts involving rape, kidnapping, sodomy, and the murder of a child under 14 years old. Sipple first reported her daughter as a missing person in Columbus on December 13th before the body was discovered in Phoenix City less than 24 hours later. Sipple is facing 3 murder charges. She faces life in prison if convicted. She's not eligible for the death penalty under these charges under Alabama law. Russell County Chief Deputy DA Rick Chancey cannot talk about the details of this case because of a gag order issued by Circuit Court Judge David Johnson. But Chancey.
So thank you all for listening to that particular news clip. Does anyone have any feedback or just questions or initial reactions about the case that we just shared? And this is just one example of a situation that ended tragically for a 5-year-old child. And so it's so important. And the reason why we're sharing the information today is that it's so important that we recognize these cases as far in advance as possible. And sometimes there are red flags and things that we can be on the lookout for. But I will, of course, recognize the fact that sometimes it's very difficult to recognize when a child is experiencing familial trafficking or even at risk for familial trafficking. But the hope is that the more we share information amongst one another as professionals, the more we can be educated and able to look out for some of the signs of familial CSEC and be sure to connect those families and children with the necessary resources. So thank you all again for watching that.
New details.
So additional perpetrator characteristics that we need to pay attention to. Fathers are the second most common type of trafficker in the family facilitated CSEC cases. The same Spring and Cole study found that a father was a trafficker in 32% of cases. Our Georgia data reveals that oftentimes fathers are sort of that second perpetrator in familial trafficking cases. Oftentimes the fathers are motivated by money, status within their immediate community, access to other children, especially when there is some form of CSAM or childhood sexual abuse images or materials involved. Also, the Spring and Cole study found that other family members were the traffickers in 3.2% of cases, and their motivations were mostly financial. And so oftentimes there is a primarily financial component to the child's exploitation. We've had cases where the child's mother was involved in sex work and potentially being trafficked herself, and the father was the trafficker. And the father started grooming the child at a very young age to eventually be trafficked as well. And sometimes the father will start out as the initial person who is sexually abusing and raping and assaulting the child. And then that is their way of preparing them for the sexual assault and rape and things that they'll experience at the hands of other buyers or purchasers of sex with children. So what are some of the methods that perpetrators are using when they exploit children? So we know that children can be exploited by family members in several different ways. They may be exploited within the family home. They may be forced into street exploitation. They may even be transported to other homes and businesses to be exploited or photographed or recorded for, again, those child sexual abuse images or materials that we talked about. Some children may even be forced to work in strip clubs or brothels or family businesses that are being owned and operated by the family. Family members and caregivers may use threats, intimidation, parental authority to recruit and maintain the victim's authority or compliance. However, a caregiver or family member's authority over the child just by the fact that they are the parent is usually enough to compel obedience. And so oftentimes children, if they grew up in the context of that abuse and neglect, it may be normalized within that child's family unit. So that child may not even have the wherewithal to understand what's happening to them, especially if that child doesn't have access to other safe and supportive adults. And so we're thinking about children that are too young to maybe start going to school, children who are intentionally withheld from school, children who don't have access to other caregivers or adults in their life. The family may be very insular and they don't really invite people in or allow their children to go to other homes or visit with other family members. And oftentimes because of that, the child does not really understand that what's happening to them is not okay and it's not normal. And so it helps when other safe, supportive adults have access to those kids so they can sort of disrupt some of the trauma and abuse that they are experiencing. So we have to consider this. When the family member is the trafficker, the exploitation is often normalized and accepted within the family culture, sometimes spanning generations. We have worked with children and victims whose grandparents had experienced the same thing. And it's sort of this generational trauma that continues to occur over and over again. And as we talked about earlier, because of the normalization, the children, the family members, the parents don't necessarily think anything is wrong with what's happening to that child. And so those are things that we have to keep in mind when we're providing services to these families. So what are some of the immediate and long-term outcomes of familial trafficking or family facilitated CSEC? So we know that trafficking victims in general, there are or it can even occur afterwards. And so some outcomes may include that child may start to use substances to self-medicate as a result of what's happening to them. We've had children share that they started using substances as early as 10 years old because of what was happening in their household. The children may experience suicidal ideation. There may be some bipolar disorder or diagnoses for bipolar disorder, maybe at older ages, low self-esteem, sleep disturbances and nightmares, and hypersexualization can be an outcome where now these children have been exposed to so much that now they're acting on some of the things that they've experienced. PTSD, depression, dissociative disorders, attention deficit hyperactive disorder, anxiety disorders, mood disorders, you name it. And a lot of times, many of the kids that we're working with who've experienced any form of commercial sexual exploitation, they have a list of psychological disorders and mental health challenges that they're working through. And so these are just some of the diagnoses that we often see, not only with CSEC victims or victims of other forms of CSEC, but with victims of family facilitated CSEC as well. All right, so if everybody could just take a deep breath in and blow it out, because a lot of what we shared is very difficult and very heavy information. And oftentimes it can be a question of, well, what can I do about it? What are we as a state doing to address this issue? How are we making sure that children are safe and protected? And that question is something that I think many of us can answer in our respective positions, because the work that you do every day is work to help eradicate the issue of child sex trafficking. All right. Looks like we have a comment or a question here. So we have someone, last name Zimmerman. So by me working many years in this area, I don't want to always be suspicious or think that a child is being exploited or harmed, but how do I identify, or what are some definite signs of family or familial trafficking / exploitation? Great question. Thank you for that. And I think it's Carmel. We are going to jump into some of that in just a few slides. And then if you have any additional questions, or if we have any partners that have some additional signs to add to that, we certainly will. So thank you for that question. We are definitely going to hop into that. Any additional questions about the previous section that we just discussed? All right. Feel free to drop anything in the chat. So what are some barriers to recognize this issue? One is some of the harmful misperceptions about where and how family facilitated CSEC happens. Oftentimes we have unfortunately siphoned the issue of trafficking to international issue, or an issue that happens outside of our borders, when in fact it's children that are raised right here in the United States that are victims, and kids that are being victimized by individuals that are citizens and live right here in the United States. So this is not an other issue. This is an issue that happens right here in our country. A child's inherent loyalty to and reliance on their family structure. So we know that young children especially are completely reliant on their family and their caregivers. And so it's very difficult for that child to be able to separate themselves from that family, or even make a disclosure, just due to the reliance that they have on that family, or the loyalty that they may even have to that family. The child's inability to understand that they're being sexually exploited. Again, some of our kids don't have language to describe what's happening to them, much less understand what's happening to them. Victims of family facilitated CSEC are less likely to report. There are some studies that estimate that 63% of intrafamilial abuse victims never disclose the abuse that they endured to anyone. There are statistics that show that victims of just familial sexual abuse don't disclose sometimes until they're well into their 40s and 50s. And so if we have children or adults who have not disclosed, then we know without a shadow of a doubt that there are children who have never shared with anyone what has happened to them. Victims have ongoing contact with their familial trafficker. The other issue that we have is that if we have an investigation and we're interviewing kids in the environment where they're experiencing the abuse, or we're asking questions in front of the potential abuser, then we are less likely to get a disclosure from that child, which is why forensic interviews are so important if we suspect that a child has experienced any type of abuse, because we're able to, number one, get the child out of the environment, because they go to a child advocacy Advocacy Center, which is a neutral location, a child-friendly setting, and then they are interviewed by a trained forensic interviewer, someone who has received extensive training on the topic. This is not something where we just go in and ask kids, hey, is this happening to you? There are some delicate processes that we have to go through to make sure that we're interviewing that child in a trauma-informed, safe environment. So we're going to go through a case scenario. This case, we've changed some of the details just for protection of the survivor, but this is a scenario that our team has actually worked with. As we go through this case scenario, I want you all to start thinking about, number one, what are some points of intervention for that youth? Number two, when we consider the child's scenario, what questions would you ask a youth? And I'm talking minimal facts, nothing too intrusive, to just see if what the child has been through or check in and see if they're okay. And then number three, when we consider the child's case scenario, what are some risk factors for family facilitated CSEC that we need to be on the lookout for? So I'm going to go ahead and read the case scenario. Kayla is a 15-year-old female who was exploited by her parents between the ages of 13 and 15. Kayla's parents forced her to have a sexual relationship with an adult male in exchange for various bills being paid by the adult male. This adult male also lived in the home with Kayla and her parents. The parents used force and coercion by denying Kayla an education and by telling the youth that she would have to go on the road with her father, who's a truck driver, if she refused to be with the offender. So first question is, what would be some points? Like, this is a hypothetical answers. What would be some points of intervention for Kayla if this was a youth that we saw through our different service providers in our school systems, in our community? What could be some points of intervention? Anyone have any thoughts? You can come off mute or type in the chat. No answer is wrong. Do we have anybody that wants to come off mute or type in the chat their answer? What could be some potential points of intervention for Kayla?
Is this before or during?
It could be before or during, either one. All right, I see a few folks answering. She could be removed from the home, an assessment. By having home visits, you could see who else lives there, like this man. Kayla's scenario is familiar and sad. Absolutely. So let's think about if Kayla's in school, there may be some truancy issues involved with this child. So if we know that maybe she's not attending school on a regular basis, we could check in through that vehicle, because why is she not in school? Why is she missing several days of classes? When Kayla does come to school, simply asking, hey, are you okay? Is everything okay with you? What we like to recommend is identify who that child's safe adult is in that context. So if that child has a safe adult at school, maybe encouraging that person to do a check-in with Kayla, because she may be more apt to disclose or share information that may be helpful to us as providers. Of course, if you have suspicions, making the report of a suspected abuse, not taken to school. So intervention if she's taken to the doctor at any point, absolutely. Her medical provider, she's at an age now where her medical provider is probably asking questions around, are you sexually active? Tell me more about that. And allowing her to share any information around just any sexual activity, wanted or unwanted, could certainly be one. Healthy relationships, educational classes in schools, so she might know more about boundaries. Absolutely. If there are classes being facilitated in the school on healthy relationships, that might open up a doorway for Kayla to explore what's happening to her. Kayla is not in the state custody, therefore the school should, due to the many days that she's missed. We talked about that. If there's some truancy challenges, making sure that someone reaches out to maybe conduct an investigation or figure out why is she missing so many days of school. Speaking to a counselor at the school. Thank you all for your feedback. So when we consider Kayla's scenario, what are some questions, like some minimal facts questions that just we as concerned adults in her life could ask, especially if maybe we don't know all of the details, but we just want to check in with her and see if she's okay. what are some examples of just some minimal facts questions or basic questions we could ask Kayla to just check in on her? We don't have to necessarily do an interview. Does she feel safe at home? Right. That's a very open-ended question, very simple. Are you feeling okay at home? Do you ever feel unsafe around some adults? And generalizing that. I like that, Jessica, because it may not just be the adults in her house. It could be adults outside of her home context. How does she get along with the people in her house? Especially if maybe she shared with someone in school, hey, there's this other guy living in my house. I don't really like him. Well, why? What's wrong with him? Well, tell me more about that. Simply, how was your day? And then if for some reason there is a disclosure of abuse or there's a concern of abuse, of course, making a report to the proper authorities or following your mandated reporter protocol is always important. But we never want to dissuade people from simply asking kids, how are you doing? We don't want to just encourage, always make a report, always make a report. There's nothing wrong with if you have a relationship with this child, just asking, hey, how are you doing? I've noticed this. Are you okay? There's nothing wrong with that. Ooh, I like that, Carmel. If you could live anywhere in this world, where would it be? Or if you can do anything in the world, what would you do? And when we ask this, a lot comes out. Absolutely. When we get creative with kids, sometimes they can give us very interesting answers that can lead to further exploration of like, okay, well, this child said if they could live anywhere in the world, it would be with a caregiver who lives on the other side of the country and not with their parents. I wonder why, right? Another one, do you ever wish you were a part of any of your friends or family? I feel this question can disclose a lot. Absolutely. Thank you, Tanisha. And ask them to draw a picture of home. That's a beautiful one, Jessica. Thank you. Just asking the kid, hey, I'm going to draw a picture of what home life is for me. I invite you to do the same. And that's a creative way to just, hey, check in with the kid and see how life is going. Because sometimes we don't even have enough for a report or anything like that. All we have is just maybe just a suspicion that that child is not okay, but not enough to really even make a report. And so sometimes just checking in with the kid can lead to a lot. Thank you all so much for your participation in that. It's really helpful to know that you all have experience as well in working with children and using the expertise that you have to make sure that the kids we work with are definitely safe. All right, so we had a great question from Carmel earlier about what are some red flags or things that we as professionals can be on the lookout for when we're working with families and children and we suspect that maybe familial trafficking is an issue. Number one is recognizing those red flags as best as possible, but some of the red flags can include just hypersexual behavior in the child or risky sexual behavior in the child. So maybe this child is watching or accessing pornographic images at school, and maybe you've already addressed the behavior a couple of times, but the child is still accessing these images and materials and they don't stop, right? Because we know children are going to access inappropriate materials, but maybe you've addressed this behavior a couple of times and it continues to happen. Or maybe this child is engaging in inappropriate sexual behaviors at school, whether it's masturbation or they're revealing or exposing themselves, or they are trying to sexually touch other children in the school. Those could all be things that, again, that we need to explore. And certainly that can be an indicator of other challenges that are happening. But in a lot of the cases that we work, there may be some risky sexual behavior that's also happening. Generational sex work involvement. So if you, for some reason, have information indicating that that family unit has been involved in some type of generational sex work, maybe mom has been involved, and we're certainly not trying to criminalize individuals who choose to work in sex work, but we do know that sometimes a risk factor is that the family member may be grooming the child in preparation for that as well, especially if some of these other risk factors are present. Extreme neglect and a caregiver that's unwilling to accept support. So maybe this family has come to the attention of your various organizations or agencies for extreme neglect repeatedly, and services have been offered, but they're never accepted. And we know sometimes families have just pride concerns, like they want to feel like they are able to contribute to their family and do well by their family. And sometimes it's hard for them to accept help. But in situations where there's maybe some extreme neglect and that family is refusing assistance, even after it has been strongly suggested or mandated, that can certainly be a red flag. families that move often to evade child welfare or law enforcement involvement. And some of the family facilitated CSEC cases that we've worked, oftentimes when the family comes on the radar of child welfare or law enforcement and the family learns about that, they will move to maybe a neighboring county or neighboring city to maybe try to evade that law enforcement or DFACS involvement. So that can be another red flag. Children that try to please adults or get inappropriate attention from adults, and this could be sexual attention or just overt attention. And we know that children sometimes that have experienced trauma, or children in foster care, oftentimes they are seeking that adult validation. So that could certainly be another red flag for other types of just trauma that a child has experienced. But in a lot of cases, we've also seen these children are hyper focused on getting inappropriate attention from adults in their lives, whether it's caregivers or other people involved in the child's life. The child may disclose sexual abuse by multiple perpetrators. In the scenario that I shared earlier through the Child Advocacy Center, this child, and during their disclosure within the forensic interview, kept talking about multiple people coming in and out of the home on an ongoing basis. And that child was consistently being reported as a childhood sexual abuse victim to child welfare services. So that is a huge red flag. Untreated physical injuries. So maybe that child is constantly coming to school or coming to your program with injuries that haven't been treated. And then chronically falling asleep in class. That could certainly be another cause for concern. And what we say is that one red flag in and of itself may not be an indicator that a child is experiencing family facilitated CSEC. But if you start to see multiple red flags for the same child, that could certainly warrant a report to, of course, DFACS. If there's immediate danger, certainly law enforcement, and then you can make a referral to our team, and we'll talk about how to do just that. Jacqueline Brewer shared, I have had the experience of children self-medicating with eating and gaining weight. So absolutely, that can certainly be another red flag where that child uses eating and food as a way of coping. Thank you for sharing that. Any additional red flags for those of you who have worked any level of family facilitated CSEC cases? Do you have any additional red flags to add to that? Poor hygiene. Thank you, Patricia. Absolutely. Wearing baggy clothes. And we know that sometimes if children don't have access to basic necessities like soap, water, clothing, that can certainly be just a neglect concern, or that child doesn't have access to resources. But when you start to see that on top of some of these other red flags, that certainly can be a red flag as well. Thank you all so much for sharing. All right, so what is Georgia in particular doing about this issue? Not only family facilitated CSEC, but CSEC in general. And so we are fortunate to have a multidisciplinary child advocacy center led approach to family facilitated CSEC and other forms of CSEC. And so a multidisciplinary team approach to commercial sexual exploitation basically says that no one agency can own the issue of commercial sexual exploitation. It requires all of the different professions listed here, and I know that we are missing several that many of you represent, but it requires all of us at the table to brainstorm approaches and ways to effectively address these cases. We cannot do our work without the care and attention of law enforcement, our forensic interviewers, advocates, mental health professionals, our prosecutors and district attorneys and attorneys that work in other civil cases, medical professionals, our child welfare professionals, our schools. We need our schools because oftentimes you all have information on how to access a family that the rest of us don't have, or you've built a relationship with that child that we don't quite have yet. And so we need all of these various professionals at the table to address the issue of trafficking and to work in the context of the MDT to make sure that the child and the family are receiving the services that they need. So in terms of data, we in Georgia in 2022, we served a lot of kids. So our team received 213 hotline calls. And when we're talking about this is data for all forms of CSEC. So we received 213 hotline calls. We received 574 web referral forms. So we have a HIPAA compliant web referral form on our website that individuals can submit referrals to. And then we serve 772 youth. So these are youth that we assessed. These are youth that we provided services to. Some of these youth were for the previous year, but overall in 2022, we had maybe about 400 kids that were actually confirmed as victims of commercial sexual exploitation that we were serving. And about 20 to 25% of those victims, there were concerns of familial trafficking within those cases. So here we like to just share that CSEC is not just an Atlanta issue, it's a state of Georgia issue. The Metro Atlanta region, as we know, encounters a large number of children who are at risk for or victimized by commercial sexual exploitation. However, when we view the number of children who are at risk or confirmed for CSEC per county population, confirmed CSEC statistics and referrals in rural regions and in our suburban regions are comparable to Metro Atlanta. So we like to stress all the time that CSEC is not an Atlanta issue. It really is a state of Georgia issue, and that we can no longer assume that because we live in a community that is well-to-do, or we live in a very inclusive community, or we live in a tight-knit community, that trafficking is not happening and that our kids are not being exploited. And so we just like to share this map of areas where we received referrals in 2022 to show that trafficking really is a state of Georgia issue, and it's going to take all of us to address it. All right, so how can you help? How can you get involved in the work that we're doing and help address the issue of trafficking within our state? There are a couple of different ways. Number one, we encourage you all to share what you learned today with at least 3 people. Please, please, please share just one fact, share one statistic, share one insightful finding that you have from today's presentation with at least 3 folks. So again, we can get the word out that this is not necessarily an emerging topic, but it's something that we are doing better at identifying, and we can only improve our identification and our subsequent reaction and how we address it if people know about it. The second thing you can do is host a training or an awareness session in your community and invite the CSEC response team. We're always happy to come and provide training, not only on familial trafficking, but on CSEC in general. Of course, if you suspect that a child is a victim of commercial sexual exploitation, we encourage you to, number one, of course, follow your mandated reporter protocol and report to DFACS. If there is an immediate danger situation, we do not encourage you to get involved. If that child is in immediate danger, call law enforcement and then make a referral to our team. You can reach us at 1-866-NHTGA. That's 1-866-363-4842. And we are option 2 on the hotline. I will drop that in the chat for you. And ensure that the service providers that you're referring to are certified as human trafficking service providers by CJCC. We know that trafficking is a very hot button issue right now, and that there are a lot of well-intentioned organizations and people that want to get involved. But we always encourage you to just make sure that you don't perpetuate further harm by referring children to service providers that may not have been vetted or that are not a part of this collaborative response that we have in Georgia. So I wanted to share that with you all. I will also share our hotline number so you can take a screenshot of that. And then I will invite any and all questions and discussion that you all may have related to this issue. Again, this is our 24-hour hotline. It's also a phone tree that has access to other service providers as well. And then Jill just put it in the chat, access to our HIPAA compliant web referral form as well. And thank you all so much. So now we will jump into any questions or just reflections that you all have related to this topic. And then I do have a video to share after we do a little bit of discussion. I wanted to make sure we got to the discussion first, but I do have a message of hope to share from a survivor with lived experience so that we can end today on a high note, because we know today was pretty heavy. So let's see here. Crystal, hi Crystal. She shared, my mind can't get past the method of transporting a child to parties and venues where it's a part of the experience. What is this? Have you provided services for children in Georgia who have suffered through this particular horror? The answer is yes. Unfortunately, yes, Crystal, where a child has been transported to a a experience or a home or business where other children are also being exploited. Unfortunately, we've had children that have been referred to us that have had that experience for sure. And I'll stop sharing so I can see you all's faces. Sonia shared, will we get a copy of this presentation? We have a one-pager that summarizes the information here. Because it changes, we changed the information to make sure we're just keeping up to date on best practices and information. We share the one-pager, which summarizes all the information we shared. Thank you for that question.
Yeah, I have that handout. If it's from the conference, I'll put it in the chat box now.
Thank you, Jill. Any other questions or just reflections from today's presentation that you all wanted to share? We have enough time to kind of talk through some of this because, again, I know this is very heavy. Yes, Cindy, Jill's going to drop the one-pager in the chat for everybody. How's everyone feeling? I just want to check in, and I see some of the faces and folks are like, this is not it. Yeah. Few people that have some migraines. Yes, it's devastating information. It's Wendy shared, this is all heartbreaking, but thank you for sharing this important information so that we can bring better awareness. And that's the goal, because oftentimes you all have access to families in ways that the rest of us don't. And so you all are going to be on the earlier end of either catching this issue or preventing it, which is why we want to make sure that you're always equipped with the information that you need. Any questions or comments before we wrap up? And Jill, I don't know if you saw any that I missed. Feel free to let me know.
We just had one. Sorry, you're probably about to read that. Go ahead.
No, you're fine.
It says, are you all available for in-services?
Absolutely. Our team can provide in-services. We can try to make sure that we cater it to the amount of time that you have available. I will say 30 minutes is hard, especially for this level of content. But if you have about an hour for like a lunch and learn or something like that, we can make it work for sure. Thank you, Judith. We appreciate that. Thank you, Jessica. Is it true that sporting events increase human trafficking? So does Atlanta do anything to help prevent this? And it's funny because I know Crystal, you and your team do a beautiful job of talking about this as well. So if you have anything to add to this, feel free to hop in. But one of the things that we often hear is that sporting events increase the numbers. What I will say is that while sporting events may create specific opportunities for trafficking and exploitation to happen, in our experience, it doesn't necessarily increase the numbers. It just creates opportunities, designated opportunities for trafficking to happen around a specific event. And so when we think of the Super Bowl or CIAA or other experiences, it just creates an opportunity for people to sort of create opportunities for it to happen around that specific event, but we don't necessarily see upticks in numbers. What we like to share with people is that this is always happening, especially in our state. We live in a state that, number one, we have a lot of interstates coming in and throughout Georgia. While the airport is certainly a conduit of this issue, it's really our interstates. People can come in and out of our state very easily. We also have a state that has a lot of entertainment. We are very good at promoting our involvement in the entertainment industry. And so all of those different factors lead to just a level of exploitation that's happening on an ongoing basis. And so I don't necessarily believe that it's sporting events that increase the numbers. It just creates unique opportunities for exploitation to happen, basically. Hopefully that answered your question. Are there specialized programs that victims of trafficking can get into, especially youth, boys, or men? So we are doing a better job of identifying services for boys and men. Right now, we don't do a good job of that as a country. There are service providers that are creating outlets and programs for boys and men. Mark Taylor, he's a provider here in Georgia. He's a lived experience expert who has a nonprofit specifically dedicated to providing services for boys and men. I'll try to look up his information before we hop off. But you can always refer youth to our services, and then we can get them connected with resources through our child advocacy centers and just through our response team. But specific like housing and resources specifically for boys and men, we're trying to do a better job of recognizing those and creating those opportunities. Jill, I think someone asked a question about training certificates.
I saw about the training, and I put in your training website at CACGA, and
Okay.
I was going to put the evaluation in when you started the video. I'll
Okay.
put that in. So yeah, I'll go ahead. There's an evaluation link. Click to the end for your certificate. I'm going to put it in now and a couple other times. But I know Nisha has a couple more things she wants to share with you before we go.
Absolutely. And I'll take Jessica's question last. She said, we're looking for primary prevention or upstream and intervention to prevent this. Any input or research oaths would be helpful. And so you all are with the perfect people for that. Prevent Child Abuse Georgia is doing amazing work on the prevention end. And just know that really, when we think of prevention, especially for child sex trafficking, I think we try to make it bigger than what it is, but it really is those really are those safe, supportive relationships that matter, and evidence-informed, evidence-based practices and implementations in the community that can help prevent children from falling into the arms of traffickers. And so I definitely encourage you to connect with PCA Georgia. You can always connect with me. I'll drop my information in the chat as well. We have access to some databases, research articles, and things that may be helpful to the work that you're doing, Jessica. So happy to connect with you offline about that. And I just dropped my email in the chat, and then we will end with a video. Alrighty, give me just 1 second so I can share my screen here. All right, so the video I'm sharing, the woman's name is Ria Storage. She is a survivor leader right here in Georgia. She's also an author, a trainer, a speaker. She does a little bit of everything. And she's going to share a message of hope with us so that we can end today on a little bit of a higher note. So.
One of the oldest debates in psychology is the argument about whether we are determined by nature or nurture. Now, there are some people that believe that nature is what determines us. In other words, your grandparents did it to you. There are some people that believe that nurture is what determines us. In other words, it's your parents' fault. Nature, nurture, parents, grandparents, my boss, my spouse, my dog. Somebody's got to be responsible for the messes I get in. It can't be my fault, right? I'd like to suggest to you that we aren't determined by nature or nurture. As Dr. Stephen Covey said, between stimulus and response, humans have the freedom to pause and choose their response. We are the product of our choices. There was once a 12-year-old little girl who had a dark secret that she kept hidden away. Now, very shy and quiet and lonely. She didn't have many friends, and she didn't talk to the ones that she had. She was afraid they would find out what Daddy was really doing when he tucked her in at night. She had been told that she shouldn't tell anyone because they wouldn't understand. She didn't understand. I still don't understand. I was too ashamed to tell anyone. Dad would wait until we were home alone to make me dress up so he could take pictures of me. He told me it wasn't a sin because God had given me to him. And he told me that no one else would understand. It progressed as I got older. By the time I was 17, he was regularly having sex with me and would bargain with me for sexual favors in exchange for something like an outing with my friends. He was always saying he wanted to give me the ultimate experience in life. Now, the ultimate experience looked like a lot of different things. One time it meant taking nude pictures of me riding my horse. One time it meant tying me up naked, putting a red rubber ball gag in my mouth, and beating me black and blue with a riding crop. One time it meant watching another man have sex with me, and then they changed places. There were times when life was almost not worth living, and I considered a razor blade and a tub of warm water to end it. Now, I left home at 19. I met a knight in a shiny Camaro, and I left behind the father who sexually abused me for years and the mother who would later blame me for it. And I didn't have anything when I left home. I didn't have a job, I didn't have a car, I didn't have a high school diploma, I'd never been to school. And after I left, I built a wall around what happened to me, and to survive, I locked my past up behind that wall, and I threw away the key. Mark Twain said that the two greatest days in our life are the day we're born and the day that we discover why. Now, I discovered my why on August 14th of 2013. That's when I shared my story publicly for the first time. And in doing so, I shattered the bonds of shame and fear and false guilt that had held me captive for more than 20 years. I realized that in building a wall, I'd created my own sort of prison, a prison of the past. Now, Isaac Newton said we build too many walls and not enough bridges. We all experience pain or grief or hardship in life. But resilience is rising from the ashes of what happens to us in life and burning brighter because of the flames. Resilience is the difference between I didn't die and I learned to live again. Resilience is building a bridge out of the past instead of building a wall around it. Now, I've got a simple blueprint for building this bridge using the acronym RISE. R stands for respond proactively. We don't get to decide what happens to us in life, but we can decide how we respond to it. Reconcile with the past, because you know what? So often we can't grab onto today because we won't let go of yesterday. I stands for identify accurately. Identify what you can control and focus on that. Viktor Frankl said, when I can no longer change a situation, I'm challenged to change myself. And S stands for step forward consistently. If the journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step, don't just take one step and stop. You got to take the second step and the third step. You got to take a single step forward each and every day. And E stands for experience joy. Joy is not a product of our circumstances. It's a choice that we make. Choose joy.
Well, thank you all so much for your time today. Jill, again, thank you to you and PCA Georgia for inviting CACGA and myself on to present on this difficult topic. And just thank you all for your time, paying attention to what we discussed today and engaging in the conversation. We certainly appreciate it. So if you need anything, we're here. And again, please lean on our folks at PCA Georgia for any prevention needs that you all have. Thank you.
Oh, echo Cindy, Nisha, you rock. Thank you so much for coming on and helping to spread awareness. It's hard to hear, but we can prevent and help those who are being impacted. And so that's why it's important to be open to this information and receiving it. So we really thank you and just have a great day, everyone. Include self-care in there. I'm going to put the evaluation link one more time in the chat box. Give you a couple seconds to grab that, and then we're going to head out. We will be putting this recording and the handout on our website by tomorrow.
Awesome.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you all so much. Please go take care of yourselves today. Bye-bye.